Well, good morning. On Good Morning Kenya, we are looking at the power of a woman that is multi-pronged as we focus on matters of women at the forefront. I'm Regina Manyara, and today we are going to be shining a spotlight on a woman whose story is equal parts of heart, hustle, and healing. She's a mother, a family nurse practitioner, and a pillar in both her home and her community. I'm talking about Alice Wangoi Monywa. Welcome very much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
All right. So now let's go back to the beginning. You know, we'd want to know what inspired you to be a nurse, and not just a nurse, but a family nurse practitioner. If there's a difference, unpack it.
Okay, so it's a very long story. So let's go back to the beginning. I was born in Kenya, and growing up, I was born in Shiga location, Othaya. Growing up, I thought I was going to be a school teacher. My dad was a school teacher, so I thought I was going to be a school teacher. I went to secondary school in Chigagaos, high school. We used to do Form 5 and 6 at the time, so I went to Griabogaos. After that, I worked a little bit, Mutihani.
Data indicates that over 120 million people across the globe are forcibly displaced, making them refugees. This is according to the UNHCR. That is by the year 2025. Major causes driven by conflict, climate shocks, as well as crackdowns. So what does this mean for humanitarian aid, especially to those who are seeking asylum? We are discussing the fate of refugees and what those who are in this value chain have to say in regard to this matter. Joining us on KBC Channel 1 is none other than Zumratai Akin, the Vice President of the World Yoga Congress. Thank you very much for your time. I'm Regina Manyara. You can give us feedback. Get us on X at KBC Channel 1.
Thank you, Regina.
What is your take on the current status? You know, the status report that has just been released here, 120 million people displaced forcibly in 2025.
That's an incredibly huge number. And I think it just shows that there are ongoing conflicts around the world that impacts millions of people, and that refugees are, they don't want to leave their countries. They're forced to leave because of either conflicts, authoritarian crackdowns, repression, climate change, religious persecution. It's an urgent call for the international community to act to protect these refugees, because refugees are extremely vulnerable people. They don't flee because they have a choice. They flee because they don't have any choice. And I think it's the responsibility, the moral collective responsibility of the world to intervene and protect these vulnerable groups.
Now, as geopolitics continues playing out, we're seeing that refugees are increasingly, portrayed as security threats. What is your take on that?
I think there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that are sponsored by authoritarian governments a lot of the times, but also by democracies that see these people as threats because it's foreign to them. I myself am a refugee. I left my homeland at a very young age to settle in Canada. Fortunately, Canada is a very multicultural country and accepts refugees. Of course, there are a few people that may have committed, acts of criminal acts or others. However, that does not represent millions of people. And I think that's exactly what governments are using to their advantage to promote this idea that these refugees, these vulnerable people, are threats to security because they want to control the narrative.
There's a shrinking asylum space with a majority of developed countries now tightening asylum policies. We are seeing a shift from temporary protection and not full asylum. What's your take on that?
I think these countries have a responsibility because the political instability, I mean, these are also consequences of colonialism and the colonial era that created these inequalities and the land grabbing, the resource stealing, and I think, and it has devastated the continent here and also in Latin America or in Asia. And I believe that these powers have a big responsibility to make things better, to provide mechanisms, to provide resources, tools, so that these communities, these countries can come out of these difficulties to help. And I think, you know, forums like the United Nations are there to do exactly that. But today we see that it's getting complicated by politicization of human rights, of other issues.
All right. Now, we're also seeing that we have climate-related displacements, you know, in light of climate change and such. But yet, climate refugees lack the formal legal status under the 1951 Refugee Convention. From where you sit, what are recommendations you'd give?
Corporations have a big role to play in this because I think in an area where we're looking at more and more climate disasters and also the flow of climate refugees, I think corporations need to do better, governments need to do better to not only understand this issue but also normalize it and accept that climate refugees are just as any other refugees that are seeking, for example, political repression. And I think there needs to be funding available to those who are working on the ground, the local people, the local communities that are working in these extremely difficult, I think, situations. They need to be supported in a way or another. And I think also there needs to be global awareness about these, the case of climate refugees, but also global solidarity.
Even as the Global Compact is pushing for sharing and long-term solutions, why do you think we're having a sense of reluctance, you know, from the big players, you know, the developed countries actually alleviating the burden of these African states that are hosting millions of refugees?
I think it comes down to the political willpower. I think there's a real lack of willpower from these countries, but also I think there's economy, right? There's trade, but I think it's not just, you know, the responsibility of just democracies and Western world. It's a responsibility of the entire world, international community. And yes, I think there also needs to be political willpower.
All right. So what has been experienced, you know, when it comes to work and movement? You know, you've said you're a refugee yourself. How have the local integration models worked for you, you know, to allow movement as well as work? How's it been?
I think it's really important, if you take my own case, as Uyghur who grew up in the West, community really does matter. I think community building is something that I do now for a living. I do a lot of that community engagement, but also making sure that governments around the world understand the power of community, the power of grassroots, the power of people, because at the end of the day, that's what matters. And listening to the stories of people who have gone through the worst is extremely, I think, humbling, and it reminds you of why we're here on this earth, is to be kind to one another. And I think the refugee issue is just another example. But I do believe that a lot of countries are using, like you said earlier, the narrative of securitization to basically crack down on refugees. These cases still happen every day, and I think this needs to be tackled by everyone.
So now we find ourselves with you know, the UN NGO funding crisis. You know, the humanitarian aid is quite stretched thin, and it's affecting food, shelter, education, and health. From where you sit, how do we correct this, you know, for the sake of those who find themselves in places that are not home?
Absolutely. It's impacted a lot of people, a lot of different sectors, and of course health is definitely one. But I think, again, these issues are not just issues that should be, you know, taken care of or focused by one government, right? It has to be the responsibility of multiple governments, of institutions, because I think we can't just be stuck in theory. We need to be pragmatic and act. And a lot of these countries, for example, in the global north, need to show that they care, need to show that yes, they have human rights development projects in their foreign policy agendas, but if they don't actually put the money where it matters, then those would all only be empty talk. So we recommend that these governments also start acting, because it's not just one government's responsibility. Again, it's the multilateral system that needs to be that needs to deal with these crises. And I think only together we can solve these issues and impact the lives of people for the better.
In this particular suggestion that you've made, there's also a recommendation, for shared responsibility.
Yes.
Where does the host country come in? In this discussions, devil's advocates who've been sitting, or rather opponents of having refugees in one's country, said that we do not have enough ourselves. Why should we be welcoming to others? What would you respond? What would you say to them?
Because I think it's, it goes back to the notion of shared responsibility. And I think it goes back to, again, the colonial era of abuse and all of the things that came with the colonial era. And I think shared responsibility is definitely something that needs to be, tackled. And I mean, we have so many different multilateral spaces that we can use to share those responsibilities, to make sure that one country doesn't have to do all of the heavy lifting, that we can do this together. It should be a collaborative approach, and it doesn't mean that the global north is alone in this fight, but it has to be done together with the global south and also civil society organizations.
Mm-hmm. So in conclusion, from where you sit, do you think we are doing enough by refugees across the world?
I think there needs to be more protection. There needs to be a reform of all of the bureaucratic processes that are making things even slower. Right now, the extremely heavy bureaucracy and other things have complicated the matter.
Okay. How about if we leverage technology, to aid conversation as well as identification?
I think that would be extremely, I think that's the future. That's where it's going. Of course, there are different difficulties and I think sensitivities around the safety of people. For example, if you come from an authoritarian state, then you might not want AI, your data to be in the cloud somewhere, to be leaked. But I think it can, for most cases, if it's not too sensitive, it can be used, leveraged to facilitate all of the bureaucratic processes and to, for example, lift some of these extremely demanding, for example, forms. I mean, when you're asking extremely vulnerable people, traumatized people to fill in very complicated forms, it's not realistic to their reality. It doesn't join them. So I think AI can be a tool to uplift some of these challenges.
Take home, or rather, what advice would you give to the government, the host government, to make the lives of refugees better, more palatable, so to speak, from your end?
I think there needs to be, it goes back to political willpower, there needs to be concrete discussions. They need to engage with the people themselves, with the local communities, because they're the ones that are closest to these hard realities. And I think once they listen to these stories, they might want to, do more. They might be incited to do more. And I think this really does matter. And it also gives local communities, I think, some encouragement, some positive news that these governments are carrying, or at least it's a first step for dialogue. Mm-hmm. So that would be, I guess, my takeaway.
There you have it. In order to ensure that refugees get the humanitarian support that they require, it's not a one-man show, so to speak. It's not a one government say. It's a multilateral approach. That is what those who are in the value chain are advocating for. We have been hosting none other than Zumratai Akin, Vice President of the Yuga World Congress, and that is her take home. I'm Regina Mayara. Have a great day ahead.